Welcome to all of you that are sitting here in the auditorium, and a special welcome to those of you that are live streaming. Now, I really would like to take your picture because I'm so excited we're all back here. And if you're the kind of person that doesn't want to be in the picture, now's a good time to just bend down and get a tissue out of your purse. But if you could all wave and look happy. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. It's just wonderful to be back here. I hope you had a relaxing and renewing summer. Our staff and volunteer members have been busy getting ready for another enlightening and uplifting Monday program, speaker series, and special events for this year. Our house looks beautiful and our members are well served. Speaking of staff, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sally Schwitters, our new Executive Director. Hey! Those of you that have ordered a 24-25 yearbook in advance should receive them in about 2 to 3 weeks in the U.S. mail. We have a limited number of extra books for members that did not already order them, and they will be available to pick up in this house in the front office in about 2 to 3 weeks as well. Our yearbooks are late this year because we've had difficulties with our publishers, and I apologize for this delay. Meanwhile, you may access the Monday programs and special events on our website, and we also have provided copies of our programs and special events for you in your seats today. So please take them home with you. If you know of someone that might need one, bring it to them, and we will have extra copies of them in the front office if you should need them. I encourage you to read the weekly Friday email updates. This is our regular channel for communicating with members. Please call the front office if you're not receiving our Friday emails so that we can correct this. The nominating committee is now accepting nominations for Board of Governors. Resident members of the Women's Club are invited to propose candidates for next year's Women's Club Board of Governors. Proposals must be submitted to the nominating committee in writing and received in the club's office on or before October 14th, 2024. That's coming up soon. And one more important thing is you have to have the person's agreement that they want to be nominated. Don't forget to purchase tickets for the Bowling Haxel House Foundation Gala. It's on Thursday, November 14th from 6 to 8:30 p.m. I personally have heard a lot about Sue Taylor's style shoes, and I'm excited to see them. Many thanks to all of our volunteers today. There are many of you that have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to get our tea and coffee service shining clean and ready for your enjoyment. The chair of the day is Robin Hurst. Our vice chair is Anna Powers. The flowers were arranged by Janice Whitehead, and the refreshments are provided by the Bowling Haxel House Foundation. And now I give you Heath Lee, who is a renowned author, a past member of the Women's Club, and very soon, I think I've convinced her to join us again, member of the Women's Club. And she is going to introduce our speaker, Rebecca Roberts.
Good afternoon, everyone. Feels nice to be back here again. My name, again, is Heath Hardidgley, and I'm honored today to welcome my good friend, Rebecca Boggs Roberts, to your stage. Rebecca is an award-winning educator, author, and speaker, and is a leading historian of American women's suffrage and civic participation. Her books include the award-winning The Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World, Suffragist in Washington, D.C., the 1913 Parade and the Fight for the Vote, and Historic Congressional Cemetery. She is currently Deputy Director of Events at the Library of Congress and has previously worked as a journalist, a producer, a tour guide, a forensic anthropologist, an event planner, a political consultant, my personal favorite, a jazz singer, and a radio talk show host. Roberts serves on the board of the National Archives Foundation, on the Council of Advisors of the Women's Suffrage National Monument Foundation, and on the Editorial Advisory Committee of the White House Historical Association. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and their 3 sons. I first met Rebecca back in 2019 when I spoke for her at the Smithsonian about my book, The League of Wives. Our paths crossed again when we both ended up in what I call the First Ladies Book Club. I have a new biography out about First Lady Pat Nixon, and Rebecca, as you know, will speak to you today about her outstanding new biography, Untold Power, the fascinating rise and the untold legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson. We bonded first over our children and our love for our 2 spoiled, rotten dogs, Rebecca's long-eared hound, Woodley, and my French bulldog, Dolly Parton. But we also connected deeply over our 2 first ladies, the obstacles these women faced within their prescribed roles, and the many inaccurate portrayals of both women, as well as the times they lived in that we sought to correct. We are actually going to be taping a podcast together soon about Edith and Pat. Historical figures often don't get to choose who writes their story. In this case, I think Edith Wilson has found her perfect match in Rebecca Roberts, a suffrage expert, a prodigious researcher, and a superb writer. Rebecca does not judge her subject nor tell her readers what to think. She instead presents her audience with the compelling and dramatic story of one of our most fascinating first ladies, Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. So please join me now in welcoming the fabulous Rebecca Boggs Roberts.
Thank you, Heath, and thank you all so much for being here. I have to say, I love speaking at women's clubs. Everyone make sure you have a snack, and there are toiletries in the green room. And, as someone said at lunch, like you wouldn't see that at the Rotary Club, right? So, but the main reason I love speaking at women's clubs, yes, ma'am. Someone in the audience is reporting there's a very bad echo, folks backstage with the audio. They're going to work on it while I talk. I apologize for the echo. We did test it earlier, and there was a little bit of one, but we were sort of hoping having y'all here would calm it down. You can't understand me. Okay. Oh, the podium mic wasn't better? It's not just me. Okay. I'm just going to keep talking so that they can test the audio against my voice and give me a thumbs up when you all feel like it's a little bit more intelligible, okay? Thank you. Thumbs up from the balcony. All right, thank you. Well, they felt they couldn't hear Heath either. I can switch to the podium mic. You want to try that? I'm going to turn this one off. And I'm going to switch to the podium mic. Is that better? Y'all, that better not be my only applause. Thank you for your patience through that. I was saying that one of the reasons I love speaking at women's clubs is because of this community of women supporting women, learning from each other, learning with each other. And I feel that that community extends among those of us who write women's history, like me and Heath, And among those of us who want to learn from women's history and celebrate these stories and admit their flaws and faults, you know, this is not a sainthood categorization, but to elevate women's role in particularly American history. So thank you all very much for being here and joining me to learn about Edith. I like to start with this picture. This is Edith bowling at age 3. She looks so grouchy, doesn't she? Heath always said she thinks she's grouchy because she's wearing pants. And it is true. This is the only picture any of us have ever seen of her where she's not beautifully dressed. I suspect the pants are a hand-me-down because Edith Bowling was the 6th of 9 kids. Yeah. And she was born in Wytheville. I don't know if y'all have been to Wytheville. It's in the southwest corner of the state. And how about I actually turn on this? Well, it looks like it's on, and yet my slides are not advancing. There we go. This is the house where Edith grew up, and I recommend going and visiting. This is, you know, the ground level is storefronts. It's now Skeeter's Hot Dogs and a little coffee shop, and then the third window is a small museum honoring Edith. The 4th building is not part of the house. And then the 2nd level is where the family lived. And it's a really weird little rabbit warren of rooms. Like, they don't all connect inside. Sometimes you have to go downstairs, go upstairs. And then the 3rd level is a false gable. You can see it's not an actual level. So in that little rabbit warren of rooms was all 9 kids, the parents, both grandmothers, an aunt, a cousin, various house guests who stayed too long. One of the grandmothers kept canaries. It was crowded. And this was not the life the Bowlings had been led to believe they deserved. They had been, before the Civil War, planters in the James River Valley. They were enslavers. When the Civil War upended the economics of that and they could no longer sustain that life when they had to pay for their labor, they moved to this property, which John Bowling, the father, had as a rental income property. They never intended to live there. And so Edith, who was born in 1872 in the Reconstruction era, was very much raised in those lost cause myths, right? That antebellum Virginia was beautiful and gracious, and the slaves were happy and healthy, and it was all going great until the Yankees took it all away. And she was indoctrinated in that myth-making from the very beginning. The other reason I like this picture is you can see the mountains are right there. She's still our only Appalachian First Lady. I took this picture myself from the roof of the hotel across the street. So 6 of 9 kids in 1870s Southwest Virginia, she easily could have gotten lost in that shuffle. I'm not entirely sure what the difference here is between these slides advancing and not. There we go. One of the reasons that she didn't is because of this completely terrifying grandmother. This is Mr. Bowling's mother, Edith's paternal grandmother. She had been injured when she was thrown from a horse as a young woman, so she basically didn't leave the house. And she just held court from this rocking chair throne in the middle of the house. And she insisted on continuing to wear Civil War era hoop skirt fashions. She had one of those mourning brooches made out of human hair. That item on the back of the rocking chair is the tanned skin of a dead dog. It's so gothic and creepy. And for reasons known only to Grandmother Bowling, she looked at this raft of grandchildren and said, Edith, you're special. You're my favorite. And I'm going to single you out and teach you that you can be fierce and smart and confident. That was not a message a lot of young women were getting in 1870s Southwest Virginia. And in fact, it was not the message Edith was getting from her other grandmother, who also lived with them. Her mother's mother and her mother herself were very much part of that late 19th century cult of true womanhood message that was, you know, in all the ladies' magazines, where girls and women, grown-up women too, were supposed to be 4 things: pious, pure, domestic, and submissive. And I don't think it's especially fair for me to serve as Edith's therapist 150 years after her birth, but I do think those competing messages explain a lot about her, because as you'll see throughout her life, Edith really was naturally much more bent to the message from her father's mother. She was smart, she was fierce, she did have confidence in her own abilities. Even when she had no business having confidence in her own abilities, she'd just barrel her way into a situation and figure it out as she went. But she was being told she had to pretend she wasn't those things. And she had to cloak all of that confidence and brains in this hyper-feminine, actually, I'm just here to serve the men, you know, pay no attention to the woman behind the curtain stuff. So if you know anything about Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, and most people know zero, so forgive yourself, but if you know one thing, you probably know that in 1919, when Woodrow Wilson had a massive stroke, she lied about it, and she more or less did his job for him until he got better. And believe me, I understand why people focus on that moment in her life. It is outrageous and fascinating. It is also limiting, right? You can't focus on one deed in anybody's life and understand them fully. And so in other biographies of Edith, to the degree that anyone pays attention to her at all, she's sort of reduced to one of three stock characters. Either she's a naive country mouse from Appalachia, taken advantage of by, you know, manipulative, savvy political men. Not true. Or maybe she's the exact opposite. She's actually Lady Macbeth, and she's seizing political power for her own agenda, and she was just waiting for her husband to be too weak to fight her on it. Also not, I mean, it's a little, it's largely not true. The third version is that she was just being the best Mrs. Woodrow Wilson she could be. That maybe it was a little naive to put the nation second, but she was fighting for her husband first, and she was championing her heroic husband, and she was being an incredibly noble wife. And if things didn't necessarily go the way that the Constitution would have expected them to go, you can at least understand that her heart was in the right place and her motives were pure. The trickiest part about that third characterization is that the main person spreading it around was Edith. She was the biggest proponent of that version of events. And she wrote a memoir in 1939. You know, now we totally expect First Ladies to write memoirs. I think Melania Trump's is out like this week. But 100 years ago, it was very unusual. Edith's memoir, which is great, by the way, it holds up amazingly well because she's really funny and frank and gossips about everyone in the Wilson administration. But it's also in places like demonstrably untrue. And so you have to take her own memoir with a grain of salt. And she published that whole book to downplay her own role in history. The whole purpose of that book was to curate her version of events. Like, who does that? Who writes a book to say they're not important? You know, like no man ever. But because she was so invested in that version of events, you'd have to, as a biographer, you have to move among a lot of smoke and mirrors to try to find the truth. And so those competing grandmother messages, I think, explain a lot of that, right? And we'll see, as I tell you more about her life, how many times she really did rely on her own smarts and confidence and pretend she didn't. So she didn't have a lot of formal schooling. She went to 2 different boarding schools for a semester each. One was in Abingdon. She hated it. It was cold and they were mean, and she wanted no part of that after one semester. She came home and she was sent to a school here in Richmond. And she loved that. She loved being part of the big city. Her roommates were these sophisticated urban girls. And she sort of saw what life could be outside of Wytheville. But then the headmaster of the school, Mr. Powell, was almost killed in a streetcar accident. The streetcar was really new here at the time. and everybody was sent home. And at this point, Edith was 17. That's her. That's 17. Isn't she gorgeous? Also, can you imagine what sort of corset's going on under there to make her waist this big? So when it became time to talk about, does Edith go back to school, she was the sixth kid. Kids 7, 8, and 9 were all boys. And the family really only had enough money to educate the boys at that point. So Edith's done. She's 17. She's in Wytheville. What do you do with Edith? She didn't want to stay. She didn't want to, marry someone that the family knew and become the, paragon of true womanhood that her mother and maternal grandmother expected her to be. And happily, she had an older sister who had married a man and moved to Washington, D.C., and they had a baby. So the excuse was, Edith can go help with the baby. So this is 1890. Edith's about to turn 18. Washington in 1890 was booming. It was the Gilded Age. And, Washington took a pretty big hit in the Civil War, not as much as Richmond did, but it was a mess after the Civil War. And in the newly reunited nation, there was real talk about moving the capital west to a place like St. Louis that was more central. And in an effort to keep the capital in Washington and make it a real world capital, the city fathers embarked on a crazy public works project. And they paved all the streets, and they installed streetlights and streetcars and sewage. And as a result, a huge amount of money started pouring into Washington because it felt like an up-and-coming city. And also because, and I'm a native Washingtonian, there's not many of us, and there certainly weren't that many, less than 100 years after the city's founding. So you could make a social name for yourself in Washington in a way you couldn't in more hidebound societies. And so those parvenus, then the Gilded Age nouveau riche could go build a giant mansion on Massachusetts Avenue and break their way into Washington society in a way they couldn't in, Mrs. Astor's New York. So those of you who know Washington and know sort of Embassy Row, that stretch of Massachusetts Avenue between DuPont Circle and the Cathedral and all those beautiful embassies, those are all Gilded Age mansions from that era. It's a tangent. I find it very hard to have any critical distance on how interesting Washington, D.C. history is. But here comes Edith. That's the city she moved to, this booming, interesting, fashionable, artistic, social city. And she didn't have any money, but she really loved going to the theater, going to concerts, riding they were called herdicks, these weird horse-drawn buses. And in her memoir, she talks about sort of blossoming and becoming this urban sophisticate in a way she could only have imagined back in Wytheville, tending to her grandmother's canaries. So she wanted to stay. She didn't want to go back and figure out what to do in Wytheville. So she kind of looked around, and her sister, the one who had the baby, was married to a guy named Alexander Galt. And Alexander Galt had a cousin, Norman Galt. Norman ran Galt's. Galt's was a jewelry store in Washington. It was sort of the jewelry store in Washington. It existed before the city did. It's where everybody bought their, silver christening cups and wedding rings and things. So he was a man of some stature. He owned this high-end business. He was, on the Chamber of Commerce and on the vestry of his church, and he gave to all the right. He was an upstanding citizen. He was also maybe a little boring. Edith is so mean about him in her memoir. They were married for 12 years, and he gets like a page and a half. And not even like a nice page and a half. I mean, she says he was lovely to mother, and he hired my little brothers in the store. Thanks, Norman. They had one baby who didn't survive, and then Norman died unexpectedly in 1908, and he left the store to Edith. So think about that. In 1908, she owns this high-end business. And she's a widow, so she doesn't need a chaperone. She has no children. Norman's father is dead. Norman's only brother is an invalid. So there's no man kind of challenging her for control of her money. And now she's wealthy and respected and totally independent. And this is another situation where she kind of barreled into it. She decided to keep the store. And she didn't run it day to day, but she was very involved with it. And she got to enjoy a status that not a lot of women did in 1908, this independent, wealthy widow. And she was really good at it. She became the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. This is their house, by the way. They had this townhouse. It doesn't survive. This townhouse in DuPont Circle. This is a duplex. They just lived in the half that's on your left. But this sort of elegant city townhouse. So she becomes the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. And she drove this little electric car. Electric car. I don't know how well y'all can see that picture. It's like a golf cart made to look like a buggy, and there's sort of a tiller that she steered it with. And this is another research rabbit hole I fell very deeply down. Top speed on these puppies, 15 miles an hour. But because they were clean and quiet, as opposed to gas cars of the day, which, you had to hand crank and they were noisy and stinky, women loved these little electric cars. So they were marketed to women specifically, to sort of sophisticated urban women. Get your little electric, it was called, and tool around town. And they had bud vases on the dash to appeal to women. Edith always had an orchid in hers. Edith devoted to orchids. In fact, she would wear corsages the size of dinner plates. I can't quite pull that off, although she was almost my height. She was 5'9". So I have a little, enamel orchid that I found on Etsy as my homage to her, but she was known for like orchids you could see from space. And when Woodrow Wilson first met her, he said, "You're the only woman I know who can wear an orchid. On everyone else, the orchid wears the woman." So, yeah. So there she is, zipping around town in her little electric car with the orchid in the bud vase. And, think what sort of gumption that requires to go out and get yourself a driver's license and a car and run this business from this, modest beginnings. And other memoirs of the time mention Mrs. Galt and her electric car. She was sort of a fixture. And when she would go from the house in DuPont Circle to the store on Pennsylvania Avenue, she had to cross 15th Street at Pennsylvania, right near the White House, and the crossing guard there knew her and would hold up traffic for her little electric car. So that's the life she was living and enjoying. She went to Europe every year. She got her dresses from Worth. She had amazing hats. She had, as you might imagine, very good jewelry because she owned a jewelry store. And she was absolutely happy being that person. Meanwhile, that's her at this era. Isn't that an amazing picture? This is actually the picture that's the cover of my book, because I love her sort of looking out, shoulders back to the future. My publisher colorized it sort of Tiffany blue on the book, which I adore. I love the picture on the cover. There's no reason to believe this dress was blue, but it is a great picture. So in this era, between when Norman died and when Edith met Woodrow Wilson was coming up through politics. So from y'all's left, my right here, that is Jessie Wilson, the middle daughter, Ellen Wilson, his first wife, Nell Wilson, the youngest, Margaret Wilson, and the president. So Woodrow Wilson didn't come up through politics at all. He was an academic. He taught at several colleges, ended up at Princeton, became president of Princeton, was then recruited to run for governor of New Jersey in 1910, won, took office in 1911, and then was recruited to run for the Democratic nomination for president in 1912. So he had been in politics for a minute and a half by the time he moved to Washington. And the 1912 election, if y'all remember, is, so William Howard Taft was the Republican incumbent, but Teddy Roosevelt decided to challenge him on a third-party ticket, the Bull Moose Progressive Party. And so they split the Republican vote. It's still the third party that's gotten the most votes of any candidate in American history. They split the Republican vote and would have elected, you know, kind of any old Democrat that year, but the Democrat who had won the nomination was Woodrow Wilson. So he comes to Washington in 1913 as sort of an accidental president without any foreign policy experience and very little political experience at all. He had a reputation as a reformer. He had taken on the Democratic machine in New Jersey, and he is very professorial. That's his whole image, which he encouraged. He's still our only president with a PhD. He develops this reputation for sort of moral righteousness. One of his biographers described him as the most Presbyterian president we've ever had. He is very much black and white in his thinking. He knows right from wrong. He's not a big compromiser. There's not a lot of gray area for Woodrow Wilson. And he doesn't take naturally to the social life of Washington at all. And Ellen, his wife, is even more of a fish out of water. She was a great academic wife. She was quite an accomplished woman herself. But the papers were vicious to her. They made fun of her hair and her clothes. And the daughters, who were all in their 20s and did move to Washington with their parents, were a little bit more successful socially. And in that first year, the two younger ones got married. So in 1914, Ellen died. The two younger daughters are out of the house. The oldest daughter, Margaret, was trying to make a name for herself as a soprano. So she was out on tour trying to build a singing career. I've heard a recording. There's a reason she was never a success. It's not fair. So the recording I've heard is the anthem, and she has a perfectly serviceable soprano, but she made the mistake of doing the, oh, no, the free. Don't do it. Go. So she was out of the house because she was trying to build a singing career. And so there's no real first ladying going on at all at this point. Not that much needed to be done. The Wilsons already had cut the social calendar way back, and now they're in mourning, and so there's not a lot of hostessing. But to the degree that anything is social in the White House at all, and Wilson was, I have to say, genuinely heartbroken over Ellen's death. I don't want to pretend he was cavalier about it. He was depressed, actually, and his doctor, Carrie Grayson, was worried about him. Worried that he needed more support, more people around him. He had gone from having 3 daughters and a wife to having 0. And the war was heating up in Europe. He didn't expect to be a foreign policy president. He was out of his depth, and he was all alone. And to the degree that anybody was keeping him any company, it was his cousin, Helen Bones. Helen is that stern-looking woman in the hat on your left. Helen was Woodrow's cousin, and she had been brought in to be Ellen's private secretary. That's Dr. Carrie Grayson in the middle, and Nell Wilson McAdoo, the youngest daughter. They're at the races. So Carrie Grayson was also friends with Edith, just from town. So he goes to Edith and he says, go make friends with Helen. Poor, sad Helen. She's all alone, she's out of her depth, go be nice. And Edith says, no. She said, I want no part of the White House. I'm not part of federal Washington, I'm part of local Washington, and that's just not a scene I want to pay any attention to. And Grayson says, you don't have to pay any attention to federal Washington, just go be a friend. It's a personal request, not a political one. So Edith acquiesces, and it turns out she actually likes Helen, and they become friends. And the main thing they did together was go for walks in Rock Creek Park. And they'd sort of troop around in the park together, and then they'd go back to Edith's lovely townhouse in DuPont Circle for tea. And one day in 1915, Helen says, come back to the White House for tea instead. And Edith says, no, we've just been in the park, my boots are a mess, I'm not walking into the White House with mud on my shoes. And Helen says, actually, I insist. Like, let me be the host instead of constantly imposing on your generosity. You won't see anybody. The president's off playing golf with Dr. Grayson, and we can take the elevator straight up to the family quarters. You won't see anyone. It'll be fine. Edith says, sure. They go to the White House. It's a total setup, either from Helen or Dr. Grayson or both of them. The elevator goes up to the family quarters, the door opens, and there's the president and Dr. Grayson right off the golf course, ready to welcome them to tea. The president is done for in that moment, like love at first sight, goner. And we know that because their letters survive. Now, that Presbyterian, morally righteous, intellectual snob, let me tell you, against all odds, that man's letters are steamy. Like, who knew Woodrow Wilson had it in him? But you read them 100 years later and you sort of blush, you know? I mean, it is quite something. And not only are his letters sort of fervent from the very beginning, but equally interesting to me is her letters back, which not only keep him at arm's length, but they keep changing the subject. So he'll write, you know, you're beautiful and perfect, and I want to kiss your eyelids. And she'll write back, oh, that's nice. Listen, do you think William Jennings Bryan is going to resign as Secretary of State? Who do you think is going to take his place? Maybe you should appoint me. What? The day he proposed to her 5 weeks after they met. She turned him down. She said, I'm happy to keep dating, but I don't know you very well. And the morning after that proposal, he writes her this letter about how she has his heart and how she's the most perfect woman he can imagine. And she writes back, you know, your last letter to the Germans about the sinking of the Lusitania was not your best work. and maybe you should have me edit your stuff from now on. And this keeps up throughout the summer of 1915. At one point, he writes this letter saying, you came to tea with Helen at the White House yesterday, and I snuck into the green room to spy on you through the lace curtains. And this is the President of the United States during wartime, right? And how clever you were to sit where I could see you through the lace curtains. It's amazing. And she keeps writing back, asking about political stuff. And he finally figured it out. He didn't stop with the kiss your eyelids stuff, but he finally would accompany his letters with a big packet of like diplomatic correspondence and pending legislation. And like, you know, whatever, secrecy be damned. He'd just messenger these packets over to her house on DuPont Circle so she could read up and be in the know. The flirting by policy analysis seems to have worked. Over the summer of 1915, fall of 1915, she finally admits she loves him. And when he proposes again, she says, I'll marry you if you lose re-election. I don't want to be first lady. I don't want people thinking I'm marrying the office, not the man, is what she said. He seems to have only heard, I'll marry you, and starts telling everyone they're engaged. So at the end of 1915, a little over a year after Ellen died, he marries Edith. Not in the White House, in her townhouse in Dumont Circle. That is the sweetheart picture that newspapers published. Right? Isn't it such a great artifact? It's so 1915. So now it's 1916. They get married in December of 1915. Now it's 1916, and it's an election year. And Edith turned out to be a pretty good campaigner. She never gave speeches or interviews or took on a cause the way a lot of first ladies did, but she showed up at everything. And she had lovely manners. And again, she had no idea how to do political campaigns, but she had beautiful manners and she made everybody feel important, and she shook all the right hands, and she was gracious and lovely and made everybody fall in love with her. And that goes a long way when the candidate is a cold fish. So Wilson did win in the 1916 re-election campaign, not by a lot. And interestingly, so by 1916, some states had enfranchised women, almost all in the West, and almost all in sort of big empty states where like 11 people lived, where they were trying to maximize their political clout by making as many voters as possible. So Wyoming was first, Montana, Idaho. And even though Wilson was anti-suffrage and was known for dragging his feet on a federal amendment, California is the state that put him over the top, and specifically the women voting in California. So he didn't know he had won for a good 7-8 days after the election in 1916 because they needed to get the returns in from California. So, you know, everything old is new again. So 1917 dawns, and now the US is involved in World War I. So being a wartime first lady is a whole other ball of wax, and Edith turned out to be pretty good at that too. She was particularly good at that sort of collective example part of wartime public facing. She, you know, joined the Red Cross, and she did the Meatless Mondays and the Wheatless Wednesdays and things like that. She also, and this is one of my favorite weird details, she had sheep grazing the White House lawn. In theory, to free up the landscaping staff to do war work. But also, obviously, you know, walk or drive by the White House and there's a bunch of sheep there. It sort of reminds you that we are not living in normal times. And the sheep, first of all, they multiplied because they were sheep. So there were quite a lot of them. And they got very floofy. Woolly, I suppose, is the actual word. And she conceived of this plan to shear them and auction the wool off state by state and sort of make it a contest to see which state could raise the most money. And then the money went to the Red Cross. So she was just good at that kind of stuff. If you ever go to the Wilson House in, well, actually two places, the Wilson Birthplace Museum in Stanton and the Wilson's House in DC, both have a collection of that wool. The one in Washington is in this sort of shadow box, and it looks the way it might smell. Let's put it that way. It's sort of dirty and very raw. And at Stanton, they have it in a box. It's so weird and delightful. So ask to go see it if you ever go to either of those places. So then 1918, the war is over, and the peace negotiations start in Paris. That's what this picture is from. Wilson insisted on going to Paris in person to negotiate the treaty. That was controversial at the time. Presidents didn't really travel. I think Teddy Roosevelt inspected the Panama Canal for like an afternoon, and that was about it as far as foreign travel from presidents at the time. But in addition to just the logistics, there was a sense that treaty making is messy, right? You give, you take, you make compromises, and that Wilson could maintain his moral high ground if he stayed in Washington and let his Secretary of State do the ugly work, and then he could, you know, sort of judge from on high and keep his hands clean. But he was never going to go for that idea. Wilson, as you might remember, his whole justification for US involvement in World War I, we didn't have territory at stake. The reason he justified sending American troops was so that we would have a voice in the peace, that America would have earned a seat at the table determining what the post-war world looked like. And specifically, Wilson had this vision of a League of Nations, that it would be a cooperative agreement among nations where, you know, all for one and one for all, and that it would ensure global peace after this horrific war. So Wilson wanted to go to Paris himself to ensure that the League was part of the treaty. And where Wilson went, Edith went, so off they go to Paris. They were there for the better part of 6 months. Yeah, think about that in an age without mass communications, right? They could telegraph back, but the president was really gone. And the treaty negotiations took forever, because first they had to go visit the royal family here and attend the ceremony there, and there was a lot of pomp. And as you might imagine, it was the biggest news story anywhere. And so their pictures are everywhere on the front page of every newspaper. And so suddenly Edith is in all these pictures. And no first lady had traveled abroad at all while first lady. And now we expect that international diplomacy role to be part of the first lady's portfolio, but it wasn't before. But the fact that she's there at Buckingham Palace, and again, because she just barreled her way into things, and Wilson was shy and didn't like being seen put a foot wrong, and she'd just go in and say, "Are we wearing gloves to dinner? What are we doing?" And she spoke her extremely homemade French that had been taught to her by Scary Grandmother, but Scary Grandmother taught herself French, so there was some eccentric pronunciation in there. But again, Edith's like, "I don't care, my French is terrible, I'll just go make it all nice for Woodrow." So the treaty's negotiated, they come back in the beginning of the summer of 1919, and in the 1918 midterms, the Republicans had taken control of both the House and the Senate. So Senate ratifies treaties. And there were folks in the Republican Senate who were just never going to ratify this treaty because they didn't want to give a Democratic president a win. But there were others who might have compromised on it, but they really objected to the League because they worried that it took the power to declare war away from Congress. And in our Constitution, it is Congress who declares war. And they worried that if we were bound to this pact, that power would be taken away from them. But Wilson won't compromise. Absolutely not. There's no middle ground. You vote yes or no on this treaty. I'm not going back to our partners. I'm not going to have any sort of concession. Absolute, roadblock. There's no middle ground. So throughout the summer of 1919, the treaty negotiations are just at a total impasse. And Wilson was never the healthiest dude to begin with. He had always had vision problems and digestive problems, and the time in Paris really exacerbated all of that. He had no ability to eat regular meals or get exercise or get good rest. And also, it was 1918. There was a flu epidemic. He caught a flu in Paris. It's not clear whether it was the Spanish flu, but there were plenty of other strains going around. So by the time he came back from Paris, he was already pretty weak and sick. The treaty negotiations only exacerbate all of that. He decides the only thing for this impasse is he has to take the message of the League to the people. Again, an era before mass communications, the way to take the message to the people is to get on a train and go to them, which was a terrible idea, right? You don't take a sick, weak man and put him on a 100-degree train car in August and truck him around the nation where he's shaking hundreds of hands and giving dozens of speeches and really not getting any exercise or healthy meals or good sleep. And so everyone tried to talk him out of it. Edith did, Dr. Grayson did, Joe Tumulty, his chief of staff did, and he wouldn't hear of it. He sort of liked the idea of being a martyr to a cause. Let's see if there's a tissue or something here. So he insists on going on the train trip, and all they can do is go with him. So Edith and Tumulty and Grayson all get on the train with him. It's just as bad as they fear. He starts having headaches so terrible that he's blinded by them at some points. And this is another picture from Paris. And they keep trying to limit his time. This part of her memoir is sort of heartbreaking because she keeps saying, I'd see a hole in the schedule where I'd think he'd finally get to rest. And inevitably someone would get, oh my goodness, thank you. See, women's clubs. Fall allergies are terrible. Should think he'd finally get to rest moving from town to town, but inevitably some local politician would get on the train with them and say, "I'll ride with you to Sioux Falls and tell you all about my pet project," right? So the train tour went sort of through the northern part of the Midwest to Washington State, down the coast, was doubling back up through the Rockies when the president collapsed. They canceled the rest of the train tour. The train goes speeding back to Washington. He was sort of better enough to be able to wave to the crowds. They take him to the White House, where a week later he collapses again. massive, massive stroke. His whole left side was paralyzed. And the way Edith tells it in her memoir, which again, grain of salt, the doctors went to her and said, he must be kept very quiet. The treatment for stroke is that you can't face stress or bad news. Your body needs to be kept very still. Well, what does a president do all day but face bad news and stress and hard decisions? So basically, if he does all the things he was elected to do, he's going to die. But he can't quit, because the only thing keeping him alive is this dream of the League of Nations. And if he quits, you'll take away his motivation for ever improving. So if he's president, he dies, and if he quits, he dies. So, and also, P.S., if he dies, maybe there will never be world peace. So you, Edith, you have to do his job for him until he's better enough to do it himself, which is preposterous, right? Like, we have someone whose job it is to step in when the president is sick. They're called the vice president. I will give any of you $1 million right now if you know who Woodrow Wilson's vice president was. He was a completely forgettable guy named Thomas Marshall. He was kind of the court jester of the Wilson administration. He wrote a memoir called A Hoosier Salad. He wanted no part of the presidency. And the 25th Amendment didn't exist yet, so the succession was a little murky. So Edith and Tumulty and Grayson just circle the wagons, and they lie to everybody. They lie to the public, they lie to the press, they lie to the cabinet, they lie to the Congress, they lie to the president himself. He never knew how sick he was. And to the degree that anybody is presidenting through the fall of 1919, spring of 1920, it's Edith. She's meeting with diplomats, she's drafting legislation, she is sending out statements from the White House, she is deciding what gets through the door and what doesn't. He was kept in such an echo chamber, and I know we want to get to questions, that he at one point considered running for a third term in 1920 because he had no idea that he'd never survive physically, and he really had no idea he'd never win. He thought those train crowds were still out there waiting for him because no one was telling him any different. So when Warren Harding was elected in 1920 in an absolute landslide, the only American voter who was surprised was Woodrow Wilson. Sorry, back to this picture. At one point, the local press corps, the Washington Press Corps, said, you know, if he's okay, let us see him, and if he's not okay, we kind of need to know that. And they propped him up in a car and drove him around town. This is April of 1920. He hadn't been seen in public since October of 1919. They had to find a cape coat because he couldn't thread his arm through the sleeve because he was paralyzed, and they had to kind of wedge him in the corner of the car to make sure he didn't tip over. So there's Edith and Carrie Grayson looking very concerned. He got a little bit better to the point where he could pose for pictures like this with a sympathetic magazine writer, but he really never got better. By the time Warren Harding came into office, Edith finally started describing him as an invalid. In 1921, they leave the White House. They decide to stay in Washington. They buy the house in Calorama that's now a museum. He died in 1924. He didn't even live 3 more years. She lived till 1961. This is a picture of President Kennedy handing her the pen with which he signed the legislation creating a Wilson Memorial. The Wilson Memorial, they decided not to make it a marble statue. It's a living memorial. It's the Wilson Center. And in that time, she went back to being sort of a fabulous, wealthy widow about town, but she also curated his image. So this, myth of the saintly visionary of global peace that we're sort of tearing down about Woodrow Wilson these days was to a large degree a myth of her making. And that is Edith Wilson's story. I'm delighted to take questions in the few minutes we have left. Thank you. Thank you for not making it so the only applause I got was when the mic finally worked. I think there are some folks at the back who have microphones, if you've got a hand up. Yeah. And I'm vain enough that I took off my glasses, but now to see you, I will put them back on.
Is it on? Oh, what was the age difference between the two?
16 years. So when they first got together in 1915, Edith was 43 and he was 59. Yeah. Other questions? I can hear you. Go ahead. I'll repeat it.
Okay, we often hear first ladies, they're entertaining and they're in the White House. Is she
Entertaining?
entertaining?
Yeah. So, once the war came, she couldn't do a lot of that. And then he got sick. But in 1916, right when she first started as First Lady, and can we just say being First Lady is bonkers, right? Like you have no job description and you have the eyes of the world on you. She loved that part of it. She was much better at it than Ellen ever had been. And she changed some protocol around. There had been some very strict rules about who stood in front of the rope and behind the rope. And it was all archaic and silly. And she said, this is archaic and silly. And did away with a lot of the more obscure White House protocol rules. And she did some smart things about, as war was heating up, there had always been one diplomatic reception. Well, you couldn't have England and Germany in the same reception, right? So you had to kind of divide up groups, and that was tricky there were lots of people in the middle, and which reception did they go to? So the social side of it, in the minute she had to do that, yeah, for sure. Over here.
What part did the women's right to vote play in all this?
Right. What role did women's right to vote play in all this? Well, I mentioned women's vote putting Wilson over the top in 1916. I will say Edith was anti-suffrage, which kills me, right? Why was this car-driving, business-owning, independent woman not interested in fulfilling her full rights as a citizen? And I think some of it, certainly later, when the suffragists started directly criticizing Wilson and picketing the White House, she hated that. She brooked no criticism of him at all. But even before that, I think it was basically rooted in class. There was sort of something not nice about those women out there demanding the vote. And there were many, many anti-suffrage women, and their message was, we rule the domestic sphere, we should be proud of that, we shouldn't sully our hands by wanting what the men have, we should own our own lane and not pretend that it's not enough for us. And you saw arguments like that a generation later against the ERA. She could have had social cover. There were plenty of fancy women involved in the suffrage movement if she wanted it. But I think there was just something in her kind of Southern Belle vision that it was just a little bit tacky. I will say, once she got the right to vote, she sure used it.
Of the diplomatic contact that she might have had?
Yeah, so the question is, has there been analysis of the legislation and diplomatic moves she made while he was sick, I assume? So she didn't, go rogue. She didn't do anything he wouldn't have done. She knew his mind very well, and that's the agenda she put forward. I would say the larger impact of her serving as the nation's executive is the bubble she kept him in, because he lost all political judgment, and because he was getting incredibly limited happy slappy news about his agenda. And so even if she was consulting him on everything, and it's pretty clear she wasn't, his political instincts were all off because he wasn't hearing any criticism because she wasn't telling him. So I think the lasting impact of her time as acting executive is not so much a specific piece of legislation, although it is possible she vetoed the Volstead Act, but more that she kept him, and by extension, other members of the cabinet, from being able to exercise accurate political judgment. One more in the back? Yeah. Sorry, Margaret. Yeah.
I was curious how his daughters reacted to her, what their relationship was.
Yeah, how his daughters reacted to their father marrying her less than a year or about a year after their mom died. So in public, they were lovely about it. They said they wanted to see their father happy, and she made him happy. In private, some of their letters are a little snarky. They talk about Edith's family is awful, and Edith won't take a hint. And later on, both Jessie and Margaret, the older two, died quite young. But Nell and Edith sort of kept the Wilson flame alive together for a very long time, and they had a pretty massive falling out, in part because Nell's husband, shockingly, it was the scandal of the day, was Wilson's Secretary of Defense, and he thought he should be Wilson's heir apparent. But since Wilson never really designated an heir apparent, because he thought he was going to run again, McAdoo thought that he had been sort of aced out of his chance. So in 1924, when Wilson died, McAdoo was like, here's my moment, and he started campaigning during the funeral. And Edith really, really didn't like that and blamed Nell for letting her husband be that, you know, having his priorities in the wrong place, let's put it that way. So that is the answer to that question. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.